title of my presentation can be seen, and therefore I will begin. Reality is not obvious, reality is weird. It is of this contention that these three forms of reification testify. Ideology points to the necessary dependence of consciousness on a given social material totality. Video games generate an immersive world that is not real. Hyperstitional occult, on the other hand, talks about the mystery that is not yet here. All these three forms are united by the common attitude that everything is not as it appears. This presentation can be understood as a thought experiment that nevertheless comes from the usual practice about the three levels of reified consciousness. First, let us define what I mean by reified consciousness in its minimal definition. If you go to Oxford reference to get a modest dictionary reference that reification signifies, in one of its sentences it tells us that perception itself may unavoidably involve reification. I will mark this as the zero level of reified consciousness, meaning that perception as consciousness in act is always reifying objects and relations around it. In order to minimally make sense of objects and relations in a given environment, perception necessarily must mediate by an act of reification. This is what philosopher Brassier, by scrutinizing Wilfrid Sellars' epistemological project of the myth of the given, means when he says, although the mind is embedded in nature, it is not a mirror of nature. Sellars' rejection of the myth of the categorical given, the belief that the categorical structure of reality imprints itself upon the mind as a seal imprints itself on wax, means rejecting the presumption of pre-established harmony between knowing mind and the known world. Brassier attacks the notion of intellectual intuition as an act of consciousness that supposedly has a direct and immediate access to the reality as it is. It provides a view that, as Sellars mentions, have a direct access to factuality and as a direct apprehension or direct apprehendability is a source of epistemic authority. The notion of intellectual intuition therefore stands as a container of any kind of such knowledge, which takes itself to be in a privileged position to hold assured and certain truths about reality without paying attention to mediating instruments. Such appeal to certainty of the reality as it is can include esoteric, occult, revelatory, or mystical truths that nonetheless, in my account, are assessed as necessarily occupied by epistemological constraint of reification. The zero level is the minimal act of perception, consciousness in act, mediated in mediating process that takes an external object and relation as somehow intelligible or comprehensible. It is not a self-presentingness of a self-presenting state of affairs, but a mediated representation of external objects and relations. Let us in the broadest possible way that those objects and relations are X that is there, adapted for structure of consciousness. Perception, to know things outside of it, has to adjust and confine those things to make them known. And since the thought of being, the mind and world, the subject and object is not one, then decisively the knowledge of things is the knowledge of things reified. Every kind of knowledge, rationalist or mysticist, is thus reified knowledge. But to acknowledge this is to furnish it with better explanatory coherence, even if we cannot directly assume that the truth as it is of objects and relations is finally obtained, which is a consequence of mind and world not being one and the same. It is nevertheless proper that mind is a part of world, that mind is similar to the world, and that the foundation of our knowledge, the world as sex, provides us with objects and relations, is undeniable. If it be so, then the mind would be the only king to reign, but as it seems, the mind is not the only thing that is out there. Thus, this primary condition of any reified consciousness speaks of our knowledge about the world being always indirect and always corrigible. This is so because there is a basic difference between mind and world. Mind does not simply mirror nature, it does reify it to make it minimally intelligible and comprehensible. Now let us try to pursue better explanatory coherence by following what Brassier has said about this primary epistemological constraint, that representing itself is located in space and is actual in time, and that concepts through which we apprise spatio-temporal reality are themselves spatio-temporally conditioned. We should then move forwards and give the spatio-temporal order and improve determinacy. The order of today's world is a social material totality that consciousness is dependent of. I'm talking about ideological reification that is constantly executed by current historical capitalist form in which every mind is thus embedded. Reification as a concept is far better known as an important aspect in broader Marxist tradition. A German term for reification, Verdinglichung, refers to the transformation of human properties, relations, processes, actions, concepts into things. The term was popularized by Lukács in his seminal work, History and Class Consciousness, where he tried to converge modern sociological analysis of Weber and Marx's original insight that the socius is dominated by the commodity form. In Lukácsian terms, reification has both objective and subjective angles. Objectively, reification spreads with the universalization of the commodity form, or the form of equivalence between qualitatively unequal things established by their exchange at the market. And subjectively, reification means an understanding of the self and others as things to be exchanged in the marketplace. In other words, objective angle is the anchoring social material totality which makes unequal things equal by capitalist mode of production, while subjective angle is the anchored consciousness which recognizes its own equality as a labor power to be purchased like any other. Even if Lukácsian account has established a more specialized discourse regarding reification and must be given its due, Lukács' account is also famous for its liabilities, such as being unsystematic and idealist in the sense that the proletariat as subject is understood as having an almost a messianic role in its march toward overcoming of all reification, therefore violating the zero level of reified consciousness. That is why I believe that ideological reification is worth looking at in its original scrutiny through Marx, who, according to Brassier, rather than believing in alienated positive universality in human or collective subject, thinks of alienating activity as the appearance of essence in human sociality. There is no self-relation that is uncontaminated by estrangement. Despite that Marx himself used the concept of reification only in the third volume of Capital, when criticizing economists for methodologically reifying social relations, which translates to that economists are in error when they treat human created categories as if they had a natural existence. Reification as a process is addressed through other concepts, such as objectification, alienation, inversion, mystification, and fetishism. The crux of Marx's sound idea is that under conditions of capitalist mode of production, a social material totality, each subject necessarily not only thinks but also acts through forms that are executed by this objective process. This is the simplest definition of ideology. As Selbe notes, when Marx speaks explicitly of reification, he means these forms of misrecognition, which are also referred as fetishisms or mystifications. According to him, they constitute not only a religion of everyday life as subjective forms of thought, they also constitute the categories of bourgeois economy. Consciousness and practices it is embedded in are always mediated through and by the form of social material totality, that is capitalism. Ideology is thus a necessary condition for present historical consciousness precisely because it is socialized by the present historical world. Let me quote this famous Marx quote at length. In order to relate their products to one another as commodities, men are compelled to equate their various labors to abstract human labor. They do not know it, but they do it, by reducing the material thing to the abstraction value. This is a primordial and hence unconsciously instinctive operation of their brain, which is also which necessarily grows out of the particular manner of the material production and relationships into which this production sets them. This ideological reification causes an everyday social reality that is ruled by real abstractions, its main and most apparent counterpart being money. Money as a universal exchange equivalent is what is taken for granted and a priori, as an element without which our ordinary social reality would seem deficient and strange, but it is money itself, real abstraction, is what is strange. As major theorist of real abstraction, Sohn-Rethel puts it, exchange operates by mere virtue of its occurrence, a factual abstraction from use and thereby from all reference of the action of its historical time and locality. In and by its spatio-temporal occurrence, commodity exchange produces timeless universal abstractions. The abstractions thus produced do not spring from thought, but they have the form of thought, pure thought. Real abstractions are those entities that are abstractions since they do not come from nature, that nonetheless are real, particularities without use in itself, that are taken as timeless form as if was a Christian soul. Money, of course, is just one example out of the many, since we can also talk about many such phantom objectivities, which are historically formed yet are mistakenly taken for natural, fixed and unalterable. Ideological reification that comes from social material totality enables individual consciousness to think and act through forms that the consciousness does not naturally decide for itself. And second, consciousness takes it for granted. Present historical consciousness does not know that it is present historical world that thinks and acts through it, but nevertheless still do it. To end with the first level of reified consciousness is to begin with the strange social material totality we are entwined with. This totality appears as eternal, but is not. Now let us look at how video game, itself emerging within given social conditions, creates a virtual space that is not real space, yet still transposes to consciousness as it was real. The second level of reified consciousness is about playing a video game and taking the virtually manifested objects, relations, and actions for granted. This for granted means that a subject who is perfectly capable of understanding that video game reality is only a virtual reality enacts consciousness to make its double within a virtual world. This supposedly creates a second-order consciousness that is projected within a second-order world. The second-orderness is not some kind of otherworldly mystical domain. On the contrary, it is embedded within our current present historical world, which is a segment of much broader nature. That is why playing a video game provides us with epistemological oddity. This consciousness in act that virtualizes itself within a virtual domain, yet still is ingrained in physical nature. Reification in playing video games subsists in precisely this moment of acts of virtualization that is enacted as genuine. People do know that the ontology of virtual world is just a fancy result of hardware and software, that the avatars they hide under are not their real selves, and that the items and relations they use, interact with, and create are, in the last instance, only effects of digital programming procedures, zeros and ones, as the usual doxa goes. But they still do it. They still play the game with immersion, enthusiasm, and responsibility, as if the process was genuine. Essentially, there is a trust in doing it. Recalling the concept of real abstraction, Cleverer notes about games as abstract models of programmers that have been, in a sense, reified. Information is made nature. Video games are ritual universes, and its dynamic components are ritualizations, and ontologically speaking, it must be understood as a dimension of reality, not a fake representation of it. Yet this dimension of reality, as much as the consciousness being immersed into it, is not one with reality. To be more precise, nothing is one with reality, because reality is stratified. Reified consciousness endeavors to make it one with itself in the sense that it makes it intelligible and comprehensible. But this act of making it so is, in the last instance, is a reification by means of epistemological mediation. Essentially, to put it in overly simple terms, video game worlds are taken for granted as real, but is however virtual. This is what concerns us more within this topic of this presentation, not the ontological status of the virtual, even though this discussion certainly says that the virtual is a dimension of reality. My strong conviction is that the epistemological weirdness, that it is not possible to intuit or know things immediately as they are, itself transposes to ontological weirdness if we agree that epistemological instruments are embedded in nature. Now, to end with the weirdest instance of all, that also was the starting point of the whole topic, what does it mean when you confront, while playing a video game, a mystery that is not yet here? Confronting a mystery that is not yet here or not yet understood is a occurrence of a hyperstitional occult, the third level of reified consciousness of given hypothesis. I use the term occult here as a broad denotation that contains such qualities of secrecy, hidden wisdom, and truths, knowable and inner nature of things, as opposed to outer characteristics of them. Hyperstition, as described famously in CCRU writings, are fictions that make themselves real. Hyperstition is what enacts fictions to be sorcerers' interventions in the world. What the occult and hyperstition has in common, and what makes them interrelated, is their practical facet of magical powers of incantation and manifestation, the efficacy of the virtual. In one of the many readable books within the game, a sort of hyperstition and real abstraction itself, The Elder Scrolls Skyrim, you can read a story about a man who was lost in another realm. The author tells us that a man whispers to him such sentences as, "This cannot be. No one would guess the truth. I see the world, a last illusion's shimmer. It is crumbling all around us." This is an exemplary illustration of the hyperstitional occult found, the encounter with secrecy of truth and hidden wisdom that is nevertheless uttered, and because of that, made real. Reification here works as a conjured transposition towards a reality that is not yet grasped intelligibly. The thesis of hyperstitional occult is, the reality is not as it appears, the truth is out there, but not yet given to us in some kind of mediated way. But this thesis or incantation itself is what makes reality not as it appears. The peculiarity of this thesis is that solely by virtue of saying or doing so performatively, it creates a rift between what is known in current spatio-temporal conditions and what will be known once we get there, down to the heart of things. This does not mean that words are magic, but that an intrinsic component of hyperstitional occult, the component of not yet or not here, is necessary to epistemological functioning of magic. This is what CCRU articulates as the positive unbelief. It is a pragmatic movement of thought and practice that we believe to be real, but in another spatio-temporal site. With all that in mind, we can conclude that reified consciousness now is furnished with mediation of objects and relations that are not yet and not here yet being more true than objects and relations we have closest to us. In one of the hyper-capitalist corporate area locations of the game Cyberpunk 2077, you can come across a mural of the moon tarot card. It says that the moon reminds us that reality is not always what it seems at first glance. And you know it is true as your character's avatar, and then you go along with it, because there's no exit from the strange sameness within your subjectivity. So why the world should be otherwise? And thank you.